christiangeekcentral.com.
Hold still! You lied to me!
In my face! In the face!
Put it in the peanut butter.
In my face! I thought you said this guy was a Christian. What is this?
Liberate tu te me.
Alright, let me roll on the +2 page of many topics. See what there is to yak about. 7 + 2 is 9. Okay. I feel like I've talked about this at some point before. Do I take an old Earth view of creation or a young Earth view of creation? I've gone through changes over the course of my life on that issue. There was a time when I was certainly persuaded by the young Earth arguments. I've just over time seen some weaknesses there that I didn't see initially. These days I would probably lean toward an old Earth view. But here's the thing though, when it comes to the views that are out there about the age of the Earth and how the Bible factors into that, from what I know there are only a few specific versions of the young Earth view. Maybe less. But there are quite a number of nuanced versions of the old Earth position, There are, and taking an old Earth position does not mean that you necessarily take the view that all life descended from a common organism, from one, single organism or one single species. I don't have anything really kind of interesting and exciting to say as far as expressing my view, because I'm in a place right now of just kind of openness on the topic, and that resulted from hearing from a couple different sources descriptions of the nature of Genesis and the early chapters of Genesis and how they are written in the Hebrew in a different style from later chapters in Genesis, or certainly other books of the Bible and the Old Testament. And there's indications of poetry form and you can even see some of that in your modern English translations when they say, they have this pattern, and there was evening and there was morning first day, there was evening and morning the second day. So this kind of you can see hints of it, but it's, as I understand it, much more clear in the original languages, in Hebrew. But anyway, Dr. William Lane Craig in his Defenders podcast goes over a little bit more of the detail of the evidence, the pros and cons, and he finds himself, surprising to me, to be in a place of open. Basically, he just describes it as openness, and just listening to, after reading over the years material from various views, the young Earth, old Earth, and the different permutations of those views. What I found most compelling was his position of openness. He said that ultimately the Bible was not written, we have to keep genre in mind in any text that we're reading. The Bible was not written to give this precise scientific description of things. We don't even histories are written differently. Histories aren't always necessarily chronological as they're written in books of the Bible. Sometimes they are out of chronological order because the point isn't to just recount events that happened in the order they happened. Sometimes the purpose of histories is to, yes, recount these events that took place, but to make a point. And sometimes the point is better made if recounting the events isn't done strictly in chronological order. So there was just a different purpose in mind than the purpose that someone has when they are writing a historical textbook, or when they're writing a scientific journal, that publishing notes of observations made, So because of that, he's just found himself in a position where it's the Bible, the Genesis wasn't designed specifically to give us all the historical or scientific details that we might ask for today. So we shouldn't press it for that if that's not what its purpose is, we shouldn't, make assumptions about the text based on just kind of how it reads in English, or because of our preconceived notions of what a text purpose is, based on the purpose of texts that we read today about historical events. I would say I believe that Adam and Eve are historical individuals, but did God literally choose to, fashion Adam from dust? Well, he certainly could have. I wouldn't dispute that. But did he? Is that what the text in its original form is indicating? Or is that poetic language of some kind? I don't know. Probably one of the important things to point out is that the openness I've kind of arrived at on this issue is not a result of any kind of pressure from scientific investigations, as though I'm allowing the current views of scientific studies to trump kind of everything else. Really, I get there more from a textual standpoint of, oh, okay, so this is, I didn't know this about the text, so that's interesting, Because as we know from history, scientific understanding can really change quite a bit. Theories can be outdated because of new discoveries. And actually the idea that is sometimes promoted that like the young Earth view, that's like the view of when you're really sticking to the Bible, and the old Earth view is when you're being a liberal or whatever, being liberal and playing loosey-goosey with the text. From everything I've seen, that's just not the case. At one point, like maybe when I was thinking about these issues in high school or junior high, I might have seen an old Earth view as like conjuring up a weaker form of God. Like, God couldn't do it in 7 consecutive 24-hour days? If we're depending on the narrative of the creation narrative to establish God's power, then we might ask, well, then why didn't God create all of it within 2 seconds instead of 7 consecutive 24-hour days? Or in such a short span of time such that it can't be measured? Anyway, so yeah, I think it's an interesting issue. I think it's one that we'd probably be wise to not get really dogmatic about and get really fierce about, because another concern that I had early on when I first heard of this view, that like this old Earth view and not treating the creation account as literal, I was like, well, that just opens the door for you to do whatever you want with the whole Bible. What are you doing? But what I didn't realize at that time, which would have been again like junior high, high school, I didn't have an appreciation for genre of writing and how these books were written at different times, in different cultural contexts, and in different genres. And once you introduce the concept of, once you're aware of the concept of genres, then, yeah, you can look at this, you can look at the Psalms and say, well, yes, this is poetry. We're not saying that literally we are being sheltered in the shadow of God's wings, that God has wings now? Okay, well, no, because Jesus said that God is spirit, and a spirit doesn't have flesh and bones. But we understand that about the Psalms. We just didn't see that as quickly in the Genesis account, or maybe in some other places, So, but once you understand that, then you're in a place where, okay, yeah, I'm not taking this literally at face value because it wasn't written in to be taken that way, and you can find the signs that indicate, is this poetry form, is this metaphorical form, so it's not a place where you're saying, this I find hard to believe, and so I'm going to assume it's metaphorical. That's not how I arrived at the position I arrived at. It's not how William Lane Craig arrived at his position. So anyway, if you're interested in there's a mountain of stuff you could read from all kinds of sources, but maybe one resource that I would recommend to you would be William Lane Craig's Reasonable Faith. No, not Reasonable Faith. He's got a podcast called Reasonable Faith. The website is called reasonablefaith.org, where you can find both podcasts, but Defenders is the name of the podcast, where he really takes time to almost exhaustively go through that and other issues. I think another thing in that whole discussion of like old Earth, young Earth, stuff like that, at some point, unless you're a scholar of the original languages, you have to trust someone else. And so I think that's just one more example of why it's so important that we choose carefully who we're going to trust. I tend to trust those that have, the appropriate educational backgrounds to the subject area that they're teaching on. That's very significant for me. I also tend to invest more trust in those who choose their words carefully and they don't overstate things in order to make their position dramatically, to sell their point dramatically, There's a lot of kind of like digs that can be exchanged between people expressing views on whether it's young Earth, old Earth, or any other kind of controversial issue. And that's one thing I appreciate about Dr. Craig's whole approach to debating and discussing controversial issues is he has such a gracious, like an unbelievably gracious tone and an ease of his manner that like I'm just like, man, I want to learn from this guy, I think he must be so secure in his identity in Christ that he doesn't get caught up in kind of like the tension and stress that his debate opponents can potentially bring by their sarcastic jabs and their really unfair treatment of him. He really is so generous and gracious. If you've never watched one of his debates, I would highly recommend just any William Lane Craig debate. Watch the full debate, because you'll find edited down versions by Christians and non-Christians that have agendas of things they want to highlight. Watch the full debate, any William Lane Craig debate, and I think you'll see just how his demeanor is and just what a great model it is.